Okay, hi everyone. Um, Great to meet you all and see all your feedback in the chat there. Fantastic to be here. Thank you so much to Jeremy for inviting me to perform and speak today. And I met some of you this morning, which is really fun to hear your work. So I'm an improviser. I've been working with live electronics from about 2007. And I'll just talk a bit today about like the evolution of how I got to where I am with this instrument. But I do want to frame it a little bit around a little bit of theory. So as Jeremy said, I'm in an interdisciplinary department. So I do a lot of research related to sound and music as well. And can you still see me? I think so. If there's any issues with my machine is a little slow, so if there anything goes wrong, let me know in the chat.
Yeah, we can see your slides, we just can't see you, but
okay, that's interesting.
that can't be changed. At least we can see your slides and we can hear you.
Okay, that's fine just now, and I'll try and fix that. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so I've been really influenced by this set of theory actually coming from the cognitive sciences called inactive music cognition, or sometimes radical embodied cognition. And the idea is really that music is not something that's just done in the head. It's not a skull-bound activity, but it comes through this ongoing dynamics between the musician, the listener, and their environment, materials in the environment. And this has led to not only my performance practice developing, but all other forms of interdisciplinary research that I do. I've worked a lot with haptic technology. I'll talk a bit about that. But also working into more interdisciplinary collaborations. I collaborate with speech and hearing scientists, looking at improving music perception for people with cochlear implants. And I've also started to collaborate a bit with neuroscientists who are interested in doing like brain imaging and on creativity and health and well-being. And this framework, this inactive paradigm, sort of is a challenge to, as I said, this idea of cognition is something that's represented through representations in the brain. So in the case of music, this would be, you know, this idea that we might conceive everything in our heads, and then maybe we then notate it onto scores or play it through instruments, or in reverse, that our body is just like a sensory apparatus to pick up information, but then everything's processed in our heads. And I think, you know, from my performance, you can see that it's a very physical thing. But it's not only physical, it's also social cultural. It's also really about bringing your entire sort of history as a human and your experiences to the table in what you do. It draws a lot on Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, so taking into account first-person experiences of the world. I've written a lot about this, so if you want to get more into the detail, I will put up links and references as we go along, but I want to focus more on the instrument today, of course. But the most recent research in this area acknowledges that, you know, we need to do more work in sort of fleshing out these ideas. Thinking about musicking, to use Christopher Small's term, as a verb. So I don't think of music as a thing, I think of it as something that we do, an activity. And this leads to more participatory and relational, embodied understanding of musical experiences. And with technology, allows me to try and find some of those in my work. So I will turn a little bit to my background and history as a musical inactivist. There's two kind of pivotal points in my work where I can think about like this whole history of my being that has informed what I do. So I was extremely lucky to have access to piano lessons at an early age. Let me skip on. So this is just the history of the inactive paradigm here. You can see on the slides. So yeah, I started composing when I was 6. You can see this early piece of mine called the Floating Tune. And this is while having piano lessons, but also around the same time, I was on the piano, you know, emulating what I thought was modern music and sort of bashing the keys and playing between like really high and really low. Not understanding that that was a legitimate form of musicking, which I later learned was called improvisation. And And it's really not surprising in this view that my training as a classical pianist led to this exploration of musical human-computer interaction that's based around the hands, the fingertips, right? So I learned very early on for me to express music through my hands. So, you know, you could see me using this generic, my students tell me it's a PS2 controller, which has obviously come about because that tactility is something that I use to express music. And really the first time I started performing with computers, I remember playing a piece by a colleague of mine, and I had to like move my hand a little bit on a trackpad and just click buttons, and this huge sound came out, and there was no physicality in that gesture for me. I didn't feel like I was performing the music at all. Another key influence in how I ended up doing all this happened around the same time we got one of these in the house. This was an Amstrad CPC 464. And I remember learning to code in a language called BASIC. This mainly involved typing in code from computer magazines, and you type in pages and pages of code to write a game. But there would always be some mistake in it, and half the battle was trying to find where the mistake was. But I actually didn't learn properly how to code until I started my master's in 2007. So I started learning Max MSP then, and it was quite a steep learning curve. So when I see undergraduates learning Max, and my undergrads are learning Max, you know, so much earlier than I did, it's really amazing. But yeah, so, you know, weaving all this musical history, this history that involved computing quite early on, so that I developed this sort of personal digital musical instrument design. I was really interested in this relationship between sound and touch. To go back to the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, he has this idea of sort of the body as both biological and phenomenological. So on one hand, like the physiology, the physicality, and so on, but also bringing my history to it. And I really explored through technology ideas of liveness, physicality, sound as vibration. So as you can see, most of the instrument that I'm using today doesn't resonate, it doesn't vibrate like a piano or a violin. There's no vibrating string or tube of air. So how to make this actually feel alive as an instrument. So I actually work a lot with what's called vibrotactile feedback. So vibrational feedback on my body to feel the sound. So when I first started working with Max and with codes, the first sort of instrument I developed was a hybrid piano. This is a piece from 2009 called Transient for piano and live electronics. I went through a phase of, I guess, like Craigslist here, you know, finding all these free pianos that people didn't want in their homes anymore and collecting them somehow in vans and trucks and preparing them. This is my master's final performance. And the idea here was, okay, well, the piano is such an embodied instrument already. I didn't want to have additional controllers. I wanted to do as much as I could with the sound just by machine listening. So just by listening to the sound through microphones and analyzing the sound in various ways. So live sampling it, playing back little fragments of it, chopping it up, but having no external controllers. And it was, I guess, a structured improvisation. So there was some fluidity with the structure of the piece, but I kind of used these time windows. So something had to occur within a certain time, and that could be triggered by, say, the dynamic of, you know, how hard I press a key or how long I leave a silence, those kind of things, rather than having an actual button to advance to the next part of my piece. I'll play a very, very short excerpt of that. And I do wonder if I shared computer audio. Let me just reshare, hold on. Because I know in Zoom, when you don't tick that box, you're not going to hear the sound. Ha, I didn't, so here we go. Okay. Okay, my machine's a little slow, so if it doesn't work, you can let me know. Let's see. So that was just sort of lots of resampling, analysis, pitch detection, velocity detection, attack detection. The next piece that I'm going to play is called Control from 2010, again for prepared piano and live electronics. And there was a self-playing snare drum, which was a snare drum that had a loudspeaker inside of it that would play sort of windowed white noise and various rhythms. So it was as if the snare drum was playing itself. But in this piece, I really wanted to get away from having to look at the laptop for information while I was playing. So this is the first experiment with this haptic device. So here was a very early wired version. You can probably see there's a wire going to my left arm, and there was a glove that had 3 vibration motors on it. So just the same kind you have in a mobile phone or a pager, connected to the machine with an Arduino. So as I mentioned earlier, computers don't vibrate, they don't resonate. So even though the piano is this very physical instrument, even though you can see the loudspeaker next to my ears and the electronics were being amplified, I couldn't feel them as a musician. I really actually missed that from having played acoustic instruments for so long. So the haptic device is sending me information about the electronic sound, really just mapping the amplitude, the volume of that sound to my skin. But also it could give me cues about where in the piece I was, or if I'd managed to successfully trigger the next section of my piece. So it was giving me both expressive information and also like a kind of signaling information. So I'll play a little clip. But as I got more accustomed to this is the first version, the first trial, I guess, I find that I really didn't need to look at the laptop at all, so I could really focus on this improvisation. And all these pieces are online, so if you want to watch them, I'm just going to show you little segments today. The next piece that I wanted to think about was thinking about using controllers. But again, there's so much going on in this hybrid instrument. I play inside and on the strings. I have many objects inside. So I actually used this controller that's called a game track. You can get it for about $5 on eBay. It was designed for playing PC golf. But it's like the cheapest, XYZ on 2 hands controller. You've got 2 gloves and they're tethered to this box with these kind of retracting lines. So it could really quite accurately, but very cheaply, know my hand position. So in this piece, I used that a lot to think about, well, where on this instrument am I having the most expressive part, right? Where in this range of movement is it? And of course, it's where my hands come down on the piano keys. So in this piece, I was really thinking about how do we fit together physicality and controllers with electronic code. And often it's like matching up the boundary areas of both, right? So if you think about like a clarinet, multiphonic, that point between stability and instability is like often the most interesting part. And the same in electronics. It could be when a rapidly played note speeds up and turns into, or a rhythm turns into a pitch, right? Those kind of boundary areas. So again, I was thinking about where are the boundary areas in my code. So in this case, it was like where a phase vocoder would record the piano sound or play back some samples. And if my hands came right down on the keys, it would freeze. But then as I started to lift them, it would start playing again, but kind of non-linearly. So it wasn't just a linear mapping. So you get this real expression for trying to figure out where those areas are and matching them up. I think I'm not going to play any excerpts just in the interest of time. I just want to talk about a few more things. So let me skip on. I wonder if I can play this without... So I also have worked a lot with as you can see here in the video, this is a haptic controller. So as well as working with the feel of instruments through vibrotactile feedback, so through vibration, this is a controller that again was for gaming, but it actually exerts physical forces back on the user. So just as acoustic instruments offer resistance, right? We know that it's hard to play a guitar, it hurts your fingers, you have to push down on the strings. I wanted to build that kind of resistance into my electronic instruments. I don't want them to be easy to play. I want it to be something that I have to learn and be able to explore. So this controller is called the Novant Falcon, and it's pushing back. I can actually code in different types of forces that I can feel, whether it feels like I'm moving through honey or whether I'm pulling back like a coiled spring and using that as an expressive device. Another one I used was the Alpha Sphere. This was a sort of startup instrument that became quite successful. I was the first composer to write for it. And it has these elastic pads. If you watch any video for it online, it's like all mapped to like bass stuff for dubstep because they're just like pushing into these elastic pads. I use it in a piece for electronics, bass clarinet and trombone. So you can check that out. It's a really fun instrument. The way it sort of mapped was really interesting as well. I was a little small to reach around the back of it, but it was a pretty interesting thing. I think they still make them. Oh. And then the instrument that you saw me perform with today. So I know we want to have time for questions. Let me just show you a few little parts of this instrument that may answer some of these. Oh, here we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, oh, can I go back? Let's see. Yes. Okay, so this instrument has evolved over 13 years. It's made up of various pieces of hardware and software. Hardware, you can see I have a MIDI controller, a MIDI keyboard, I have the PS2 controller, I've got a voice processor, code that I've developed over 13 years in Max. I have various drum machines. I'm using a Digitact at the moment. I had an electron machine drum, which I love, but it's not working at the moment. And this beautiful Moog DFAM as well. I also started recently working with CV, so sending control voltage actually out from Max MSP into my synth. And in fact, the whole system is designed in this way that everything gets fed back into the software, analyzed, and then fed back out as control data to other parts. So it becomes like this ecological system that I have to find my way through. It's very unpredictable. I don't necessarily know what it's going to throw out, and that's what I enjoy about it as an improviser. But you can see in the back of this image, I'm sending CV from my interface, from Max to my interface to this Expert Sleepers module, which happened because the maker of Expert Sleepers moved to Edinburgh, where I go in the summer, and told me I needed one, and he was right. So that was a really dangerous encounter. And that then can control my Moog. So everything is feeding back into everything else. So I'm not going to go through the code, but just so you can see, it's sort of built up of all these different modules, different techniques are used. I work with my own synthesis. I work with live sampling. Analysis features heavily in what I do. And I guess we'll talk about this more in the questions, but this is to show you some of the inside of this. There's layers and layers of codes that have been built up over the year. It is evolving, but I do also feel that there's so much to learn from this instrument. I'm going to skip that for now. That every time I perform in a different space or a different set of collaborators, I'm learning something new. So I don't necessarily need to always be developing. I learn a lot, and there's so much to explore just by performing and playing. So this idea of creative practice, so actually developing the instrument on stage. So I know there's a lot in there, and I've got plenty more stuff. If you want to check out some of the examples online, feel free to get in touch with me, and I can send you stuff or send you papers if you're interested in reading a little bit more about it. But I think it would be good to move to questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, Dr. Hayes. I'll try to summarize some of these questions and just kind of funnel them towards you. So I think you may have answered this, but there were a few questions related to your movement during the performance and how that was, in what way that was purely expressive visually or actually controlling the sound.
Yeah, I get asked about this a lot. So it's just the way I express the sound, I guess, thinking of like a pianist who's, doing all this kind of stuff. It doesn't change the sound, it doesn't alter the sound, but is the way that I perform with it. So I guess I'm embodying the sound. People always ask if I have tilt sensors inside my controller. I don't. It's super simple. Like there's nothing fancy about it at all. But yeah, the way I move is just how I've come to play the instrument. So it's not choreographed. It doesn't affect it in that way, but it does affect it in, the embodied performance sense of things. Yeah.
Great. There was a question about, is there a microphone on the controller itself? It did look like you were bringing the control up to your face occasionally.
That's just because I need another arm. So, yeah. And I could code it to, freeze position and all this. It's like once you've got something that's over 10 years old, it's hard to make some of these more fundamental changes. So yeah, I'm just trying to hold the joystick. There's no mic on it.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have a question about the vocal chain. You said that you use some, it looked like external vocal processing. Would you mind walking us through that?
Yeah, so I use a Voice Live 2, which is a hardware voice processor. I also do a bit of voice processing in Macs as well. It's tricky to do voice processing in Max MSP. It's, quite intensive, and the range of stuff that I can do in the box is just far beyond what I could code. So there's various different, settings in that it can do. It can also be used as a looper as well, but it also has MIDI input. So I'm sending MIDI from Max MSP to that so I can freeze parts of it or, turn on and off harmony, change different effects. And then in the software, I am recording parts of my voice. I'm either playing them back at different speeds or chopping them up into little chunks and playing those back out of order, or analyzing the voice. So there is some nice voice processing in Max. There's some really, really old code called Gabor, which does this thing where it sort of takes away, like it just keeps all the sort of stuff. So I use that a little bit. But yeah, mostly done in the Voice Live 2. Yeah.
There was a question about how much of the piece, and I'm kind of interpreting this question, but like how much of this piece is made live on the spot? How much of it is prepared as like sample or even control data? Yeah, I think that summarizes that question.
So in terms of the sound, there's like sets of samples that are always in this configuration, I guess, that give it the sort of similar character each time. And there is a kind of structure within this. I have this sort of ultimate goal that I'll develop like the ideal improvisation system that will just, I'll start playing and it will move through exactly the settings that I want without having to touch anything. But that's really, really hard. I started working with the University of Huddersfield in England in the UK, and they're developing some amazing new tools for machine learning and sound decomposition and sound segmentation. It's super amazing stuff. So it's called Flucoma. And with those tools, I hope to be able to sort of get it to actually learn my improvisation and structure it based on like similarity, those kind of things. So there's lots of stuff with descriptors where it's analyzing sound, not just through pitch and amplitude, but through like lots of different spectral things, MFCCs, and then doing lots of kind of statistical calculations on those and also using machine learning. So there's so much scope in that I'm really interested in looking for how it applies to improvisation. Also on that project, there's a musicologist PhD student who's actually done analysis of my work and he's used these tools to look at how similar my rehearsal sounds are to my performances. And I call this like an improvisation lie detector, because it's gonna really see like how much is improvised and how much is am I repeating myself. So it's a good challenge. It's exciting. It's a little scary as well. But yeah, it depends. I guess there's this balance between the kind of ideal, Voyager, like George Lewis improvisation system that's going to always throw up what you want, and then actually the practicalities of I've got to be on stage, and I'm pretty comfortable with a high level of risk, but there's limits with that as well. So.
Well, if there's any more questions, certainly funnel them my way. I will ask a question though, following up on that. As someone who has performed live with electronics and failed myself, makes me question that risk that you take when you go up and you play with an unpredictable system in front of an audience. So I know that there's a fair amount of performers watching you right now, and I'm just curious, like maybe you can share some of your experiences dealing with failure in performance.
Yeah. So it's strange. At one of the ICMC's recently, International Computer Music Conference, somebody said, I'm like a permanently touring musician. I can't use Max MSP. It's not stable enough. And I do disagree, because there are always things with technology that will happen, and you do have to be prepared for that. I think, the most scary things for me are doing live radio broadcasts, because if things stop, you have nothing. And in those situations, I will have a recording on my desktop to play. I've never had to do that, but that's what I have. But the times where it's failed, it's never been. I had one thing that was kind of like a crash, but it wasn't a crash, and this is in 13 years. It was a bug in my system and I hadn't fixed it, and it sort of stopped some of the processing. So when I talk about unpredictability and the risk, it's not in the way I code it. That should be stable, and you should be, practicing your system like 100, my supervisor used to say, practice your code 100 times before you go on stage, and don't code the day before. And, of course, sometimes you do that anyway because it's the last minute, but you should not do that. But, one of the biggest shows I did was for Moogfest, and there was, about 800 people in this theater. And what had happened was, because of this project I was doing with Huddersfield, required Max to be in like 64-bit, and I was still in 32-bit. So when I opened my code, somehow I had to strike after my sound check, and when I reopened it, it went into the wrong mode. And I started my performance, and I was like, there's so many people, and it was like the sound system was amazing. In the first 5 minutes, it was like the bass was sounding so good. And then I was like, what is going on? Why is half of this stuff not working? And I look at my screen and there's all these errors. And I just had this moment of, what do I do? And I said, okay, you're an improviser. You have to improvise. And I got through it because there's parts of my system that will work anyway. If the whole thing had crashed, yes, I would have just reopened the patch. Sometimes having combinations of electronic and digital and acoustic can help there. So it's tricky. I don't design the system for the system to fail. I'm interested in risk and unpredictability, but my system is pretty much stable. And when those rare things happen, that's something that was really hard to avoid. You have to just, give a good performance. And I think I build it off, so.
That's great. Another question came in about how much you practice, how much you play your instruments, and the question involved like acoustic instruments too, like non-electronic instruments.
So I'm really bad. I hate practicing. And that's awful. You have to practice, and you have to practice improvisation. I teach improvisation. Improvisation is a practice. It's not just, making up as you go along. So I played, when I was in the UK, I played with an improvisation orchestra weekly. And actually, since the lockdown, I've been playing with a different one in Scotland, GEO, Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra. And doing large scale improvisation in groups like that is really challenging. There's lots of people, especially now doing it over Zoom, but those are the moments, that hard practice is where I learn my skills and I learn the most about my instrument and I learn new things. So you absolutely have to practice. I prefer doing gigs to rehearsals, but I will always rehearse before a gig for sure. Even if it's a sort of, you know, tech run through, I guess like in dance, I forget the word for it, where you're sort of not fully performing, but you're, you know, blocking, that's the word. Yeah, I was lucky enough to get a piano here recently. There actually isn't one in my department, and I do miss that. So again, I've been using that in improvisation. I still play repertoire sometimes on the piano as well. I enjoy that too. So I think everything that I do musically feeds into each other, and you know, just you have to keep your chops for improvisation and live electronics. Is the same as playing any other instrument. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? It's possible I skipped one, so if I did, please let me know. Maybe you see that one that just came in about your inspirations, or what inspires you. Maybe what recently inspires you.
So I mean, musically, I'm inspired by so many different things. As I said this morning, I studied classical piano, but I was in punk bands for years. I was heavily into drum and bass and techno, and I think that those years have been influenced what I do more than I've sort of understood. Right now, I love Sophie. She's a music producer that sort of, you know, marries pop and experimental, and is such a huge inspiration. She's awesome. Yeah. But you know, I'm inspired a lot by the research that I do. I'm also inspired by, I spent many years in the UK doing different workshops with music and technology. I worked a lot with people with disabilities and learning difficulties and complex needs. And all these experiences of playing with different communities, I've done a lot of work with children in schools and technology. I really don't separate that work from the work I do as a performer. It all feeds into what I do. So just, you know, every time I play with different groups of people, that's actually super inspiring in my work. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I think we're at time here. So if you're in the Music Tech Now course and you need to take off, thank you for sticking around. Can we all give our guest, Dr. Lauren Hayes, one big last round of applause? Quiet applause.
Thanks so much. It was great to meet you all. And please don't hesitate to be in touch if you've got any more questions or anything.
Great. Well, maybe I'll stick around in the chat just a little bit longer if you need to talk to me. Maybe Lauren, if you can stick around just a minute or two and see if anyone else has any lingering question. Otherwise, I will see you all next week.